Hi, this is Andrew Marty from SACS. Welcome to the presentation. Today we're going to be talking about wellbeing, and we're asking the question, what is wellbeing, but also, is it really worth the trouble? So we'll be talking about the evidence that exists in the world of organisational psychology about what wellbeing actually is, and the business case for wellbeing. How does one persuade a team of senior executives, for instance, that this is a venture worth embarking on? So firstly, let's tell you a little bit about what SACS is. SACS is an organisational psychology business. Our main business is psych testing, wellbeing surveys, 360-degree feedback. We're also very heavily into things like workforce planning. We've developed workforce plans for many organisations over the past 4 or 5 years. And we're also into organisational and individual development, which includes things like career transition management, an all too relevant service in these times of employment uncertainty. We design recruitment processes for organisations, and we also recruit for organisations. We operate according to the scientist practitioner model. Our main academic partner is Deakin University, and we have many publications with Deakin, especially over the past 5 years or so. And so we really try to take an evidence-based approach to people management, and that's what we'll be doing in this presentation. We'll be showing what the evidence about wellbeing is. So some objectives. Firstly, we're going to be talking about physical health, only briefly because we're a psychology firm. And so when we move on to the psychological components of well-being, happiness cannot be ignored. And by the way, there is a strong link between happiness and physical health. If a person has lots of positive emotions, they're likely to be physically healthier. We also want to talk about healthy behaviours because particularly in workplaces, healthy behaviours have an enormous determination on the well-being of people's psychological state and their levels of well-being generally. And in fact, if you want to sum up corporate culture is really the sum of the behaviours that people experience in their day-to-day life. We'll be talking about some components of what causes healthy behaviours. So we'll be talking about a thing called engagement, which is about having a positive mindset and positive energy at work. We'll also be talking about resilience and briefly how to build resilience, but also how to recruit for resilience. We'll be talking about stress and stressors, the things that cause people to be stressed. And we're going to say that you can't have high levels of well-being if you've got unmanageable levels of stress. We'll be talking also about inclusion. And that is to say that in a contemporary definition of well-being at work, a workplace does need to be inclusive. And there's been significant amounts of research that demonstrate that when organisations are perceived not to be inclusive, then you have lower levels of well-being, even amongst staff who are included in that setting. And this is going to be driven by a healthy psychological profile, so we'll certainly be talking about some of the recruitment aspects of that, but we'll also be talking about leadership, particularly local leadership. Now, what we mean by local leadership, in this presentation, we'll be differentiating between the day-to-day leaders that you work with, who might be a team leader or a coordinator or a manager or somebody like that, versus the senior executive team. And when it comes to psychological well-being, the biggest impact is your local leader. Now, of course, the behaviours of senior leaders can cascade down into the organisation, but the behaviour of your average chief executive has way less to do with the well-being of your average employee than does the behaviour of the immediate team leader to whom they report. But more on that as we make our way through the presentation. And one of the things that we get asked a lot in this whole question of wellbeing is about the business case for wellbeing. How do you demonstrate to, let's say, a senior executive team that this is worth investing in? I think that the research evidence is particularly strong that it is worth investing in, but we understand that people want to see that business case. So the physical. We're going to start off with a description of a thing called the medical model. And the medical model said that you had well-being if you had an absence of illness. As I've already said, I'm a psychologist, and in the early days of psychology, if you didn't have a phobia or an obsessive compulsive disorder or depression, then you were said to have well-being. Now, the contemporary perspective on this is what we call positive psychology, which is to say that the absence of illness is a particularly gloomy and ineffective definition of well-being. It's not enough simply not to have something wrong with you. And the concept of positive psychology is, whereas the traditional form of psychology sought to get people from -30 back to 0, positive psychology says, well, 0 is not good enough. We want +10, plus 20, plus 30. So the medical model is where we all started out. But now everybody knows that occupational health and safety is a very important part of well-being at work. Healthy lifestyles, healthy eating, whole foods, healthy body weight, and exercise. And just to go back to the psychological well-being component for a moment, one of the things that I think most people know is that exercise is almost the best thing that you can do for your psychological health. If you're anxious or depressed or something like that, you can do a bunch of other stuff, and we'll talk about other things that can be done. But if you're not getting enough exercise, increasing the amount of exercise, particularly things like resistance training, weightlifting, those sorts of things, makes a massive difference to people's psychological well-being. But of course, it makes a difference to their physical well-being. Now, tobacco, drugs, alcohol and other drugs, sexual health, mature health, mental health and well-being, all of those sorts of things from Western Sydney University are part of the definition of physical health, and then trending into mental health and psychological health. Now I'm going to talk about a thing called happiness. And if you want to have optimum levels of well-being, well, you kind of have to be happy. It is extremely difficult to have optimum levels of well-being if you are sad or depressed. Now this gentleman here, this is a very old photo of him, but he's still very active in the area of research. This is a guy by the name of Ed Diener, who's kind of a legend in psychology for researching happiness and what causes it. And that caption, cheerfulness, college freshman money, and a 33% effect size. Yes, I know I'm being a little obscure there. Let me explain what that means. Ed Diener measured college freshmen, which in the United States and in England are people in the first year of their university course. He asked them to self-report their levels of cheerfulness, and he gave them a questionnaire. And then he differentiated them into deciles, so top 10%, bottom 10%, middle this, cut them up into slices, depending on how cheerful they were. Then what he did is he went back some years later and he asked them, amongst other questions, how much money do you earn? And what he found is that the least cheerful people earned 33% less than the most cheerful people. Now, as I like to say, if you're going to try and predict how much money a college freshman is going to ultimately earn, maybe the levels of cheerfulness would not be the first thing that come to mind. But mind you, that's 33% in psychology, a pretty significant effect size. Why? Well, for a range of reasons. I think cheerful people tend to be hired more than gloomy and depressive people. I think also there's a theory from a woman by the name of Barbara Fredrickson called the broaden and build theory. And the broaden and build theory says that when people are cheerful and happy and have higher levels of positive emotions, they're broader minded. And that's the broaden bit of the broaden and build theory. But as you're broader minded and you try more things, you build your skills better. And so the two things combine. So isn't that interesting that one of the things, a self-report on cheerfulness can predict how much money you're likely to earn later in life. Now, this is some much more recent research from Ed Diener, and this was published in Nature Human Behavior, which is a very estimable kind of a journal. And what this was, is it was a study of 1.7 million people. So I think you'd agree that's big data. And what they did is they asked people to evaluate the quality of their life. Happiness was a big slice of this. And what they did is they asked them how much money they earned. And what they discovered in this massive sample of 1.7 million people is that if you don't earn much money, when you earn more money, your levels of well-being, your levels of mean life evaluation tend to increase. But what they found was that around about 80,000 US, the mean life evaluation started to decline again. So once you have a satisfactory amount of money, earning more money not only doesn't help you, but it actually can make you worse. This is going back some decades ago. There was a communications theorist called Marshall McLuhan, and you might have heard the expression keeping up with the Joneses. McLuhan said keeping upset with the Joneses. And I think what's going on here is that maybe when you got enough money, you start to get materialistic and you see yourself in this never-ending competition against other people to have what they don't have, or to be richer or whatever. Anyway, suffice it to say, whatever the psychological cause is, money doesn't buy you happiness when it gets past about 80,000 US. And here's another study. Sadly, I couldn't find more contemporary research on this. This was from 2005. But look, it's for a long period and the data is very good. And what this is showing is in the United States of America, people's income going up. but you'll notice that the trend of people who said that they're very happy tended to decline. And this certainly has been observed in a range of different places. In fact, there's a book called The Loss of Happiness in Market Democracies, trying to dig into exactly what this effect is. Why am I telling you all this? The reason is, if you want people to have high levels of well-being, don't pay them more and expect that to have higher levels of well-being, unless two preconditions. If somebody is radically underpaid and there's a justice factor, then paying them more and making the money just will cause people to have higher levels of well-being. Injustice is very bad for well-being. And of course, if people are below the breadline, then they need more money in order to feel secure in their lives and to be able to provide for their family and those sorts of things. So of course, under those circumstances, levels of well-being will increase. And the reason I say this is because I've been told many times in discussions of well-being by clients, look, we can't pay people enough. But I can tell you that we work with organizations that are in the not-for-profit sector. They pay very modest money. People come there because they know that's what the sector is about. And they have wonderful levels of well-being. We've often measured extremely high levels of well-being among staff who are modestly paid. Now I want to talk about a thing called engagement. So we've talked about happiness, and happiness is a positive psychology concept, but so is engagement. The idea of engagement is that it's beyond happiness. It's a positive mental state that people have at work. And it's usually described these days as having three components. Bakker, who was one of the original sort of founders of this theory, I suppose you'd say founder, he distilled a whole bunch of research in a technique called meta-analysis, where you go back and reanalyze data from a bunch of different researchers over decades. And what he was able to demonstrate is that the single definition of work engagement that seemed to have the greatest prediction of organizational outcomes had three components. And the first component, well, he called it vigor, which is to say people are energetic. For our purposes, when we measure it, we call it energy. But people are energetic at work. So it's not just enough to be happy. You have to bring a sense of energy and resilience. Dedication. This is a sort of a sense of commitment. And in our measurement instrument, we call it commitment. The degree to which people believe that their work is important, the belief that they think it's significant, the degree to which they are enthusiastic about it, they're committed to it. And in fact, what this also means is that they'll try to get better at it. And the third is absorption, where people have a flow state. They get absorbed in their work and they get absorbed in their work group. So flow is where at an individual level, you're doing something and you get lost in it and you look up at the clock and, hey, where did the last 5 hours go, or 3 hours or whatever. But absorption at a work group level is a situation where you're getting engrossed not only in your work, but in being part of the team. And in our measurement instrument, we call this flow, after the tradition of Nakamura. By the way, this is pronounced Csikszentmihalyi. So yeah, vigor, dedication, absorption, three characteristics of work engagement. So my question to you is, imagine if your employees come to work and they are vigorous, they're dedicated to the work that they do, and they get happily engrossed in their work. I mean, that's a pretty good description of psychological well-being at work, isn't it? So, engagement matters. Now, the business case for well-being relies heavily on the business case for things like happiness, things like engagement. Happiness, we know, is a predictor of the fact that people are going to be sick less often. They're going to be more productive. They're going to be more resilient. But engagement, which is a group effect, is really known to predict things like productivity. So when engagement goes up, in where you can measure statistically the productivity of workforces, and there are plenty of those, when engagement goes up, then levels of productivity go up. When engagement goes down, levels of productivity goes down. But also so do quality. When well-being declines or engagement declines, you'll find lower levels of quality in work and perhaps more errors. We also know that internal things like job satisfaction, absenteeism, attraction, retention vary with engagement. And for those of you who deal with customers, and that's everybody, because everybody has either external or internal customers, what you know is that there is a causation of 50 to 60% in customer satisfaction from engagement. Let me just make that clearer. What I mean there is that if you measure the levels of engagement of customer service staff, and then you subsequently go and measure the levels of satisfaction of the people who have interacted with those customer service staff, you get a causation of 50 to 60%. So 50 to 60% of the experience that the customers have is determined by the levels of engagement of the staff member who looked after them. That's important. OH&S is affected by engagement. The various work cover authorities around Australia have at various times recognised the fact that if you don't have high levels of engagement in a workforce, your workplace is more dangerous. Engagement leads to discretionary effort, which is part of occupational health and safety. Discretionary effort is where people will say, hey, I'll clean that up, I'll report this, I'll look after this, hang on, that's not sounding like it should, so I'll tell somebody about this. A lot of those things are affected by people's engagement in their work. Now, one of the reasons that people are keen on engagement in the world of commerce is that profit varies with engagement. And in particular, commercial growth varies with engagement. So in a highly engaged workforce, you get much better profit. By the way, the 50% to 60% causation equation also goes for sales teams. So when you measure the levels of sales teams and then you measure how much they sell, there's a causation of 50 to 60% from the levels of engagement to the sales. So not surprisingly, commercial organizations care about engagement. So it's one of the best predictors of organization outcomes that we found. And given that I'm going to say that it's such a big component of well-being at work, I think that's a very strong business case for well-being by virtue of engagement. Now here's the SACS measure of overall engagement. And so we measure engagement. You can see this isn't great for this particular organization, 124 people rather completed. This is a percentile, which means that this result is at the 32nd percentile of companies in Australia, so higher than 32%. Now, average, of course, is 50%, which is, as I mentioned, we call vigor, dedication and absorption, energy, commitment and flow. And you see this red line in the middle, that's population average. So you can see energy is particularly low in this work group, flow's a little better and commitment's a little better again, but none of them are population average. So what we do in the rest of the engagement survey is we measure the 4 determinants of engagement, and they, at work, I mean, because personality is a determinant of engagement, which I'm just going to show you in a moment. But one of the things that we do know is that the key drivers for engagement at work are things like the job that you do, the colleagues that you have, the leader that you have, and the organization that you belong to. Those are the 4 key drivers. So they're the levers if you want to improve levels of engagement: the job, the team, the leader, the organization. Now, you don't have to worry too much about this at the moment because I've got a slide where I'll explain that a little bit more at the moment. But people say, how do I increase job engagement or work engagement? Well, the answer is 4-fold. Actually, it's 5-fold. Recruit the right people, and we'll explain in a second what that looks like. But then what you need to do is you need to have the right work, and that includes having round pegs in round holes, but also providing them with the right conditions, such as autonomy, variety, those kinds of things, having the right leaders, having the right teammates, and having the right organizational characteristics, but more of that anon. So what causes engagement? Well, it may interest you to know that a fair slice of engagement comes from people before they walk in through your front door. So we've been involved, and Simon Albrecht from Deakin University and myself had a paper going back a little while ago where we looked at what caused levels of engagement in employees. And certainly one of the things that we found is that extroverts, particularly cheerful extroverts, tend to be a bit more engaged in their work than people who are gloomy and pessimistic, for instance. There's also been quite a bit of research to say that conscientious people are much more likely to be engaged in their work. So those sorts of things matter. Also, cognitive ability. Cognitive ability, how smart you are, has an effect on your engagement at work, and in a very practical way. So you can imagine if you're really smart and you're doing a job which is really not demanding at all, it's very simple, well, of course, your level of engagement is going to fall off quite rapidly. On the other hand, if you're doing a job which is way beyond your intellectual capacity and you're constantly struggling to understand, well, why is this happening? Why is that happening? Again, that's going to cause your levels of engagement to collapse. Now, these are on the nature side of the equation, largely because these have a very strong genetic component. Intelligence, cognitive ability, is estimated by some geneticists to be 70 to 80% genetically determined. I know that people also talk about epigenetics these days, and epigenetics, in other words, environmental factors that trigger genetic characteristics. Yes, that matters enormously. So if you are very malnourished at birth or something like that, then that's going to, or perhaps particularly ill-treated, we know that that can bring IQ down. But in twin studies, we find that it doesn't happen all that often. If people have been through trauma, yes, it will bring people's cognitive abilities down. But in most cases, there's a strong correlation between identical twins in terms of cognitive ability and personality, even if they have never met each other and even if they grew up in totally different socio-economic strata. So, recruitment. I mean, if you recruit people who have positive characteristics in this respect, you know, they're appropriately smart for the job and they're honest, emotionally stable, appropriately extroverted. I mean, there are jobs that suit extroverts and jobs that suit introverts. Agreeableness means that they're not particularly angry and difficult and cranky. Conscientiousness means that they're hardworking. And if they're open-minded enough for the job that they do, then they're much more likely to be engaged than if you've put the round peg in the round hole. Or let's say you've recruited somebody who's dispositionally very angry and difficult, or somebody who's pessimistic and gloomy and negative and cynical. Now, there's a nurture component here too, which is skills. And we'll be talking about that a little when we get to resilience later on, because there are skills that you can build that help you to become more resilient. Experience. So the experiences that you have, of course, can have a massive impact on your levels of engagement. So if you're trying something new and you've had good experiences with it, well, of course, you're more likely to be engaged with it. If you've never done something before and you don't know how it's going to turn out, that makes it more difficult to be engaged. And then there are attributes, attitudes, style, values, and this is all about culture match. So to give you a practical example, if I'm working for an organization which is particularly commercially aggressive, and I am, on the other hand, an altruistic, soft-hearted, philanthropic type, well, chances are I'm not going to be engaged because the people there won't like me particularly, and because I won't like them. But if I move to an organization which is public-spirited, philanthropic, I'm far more likely to fit in there and therefore, of course, to be engaged. So a person's attitudes and values are very important in determining their levels of engagement at work. Now, this is a result of a study that SACS undertook going back some years ago now, but we measured about 800 people and we measured their engagement with an instrument called the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale. And the reason we use that is the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale is often used in studies, in academic studies of engagement, because it's a good measure of engagement. We had on these 800 people their personality profile. This is a thing called the Hexaco personality profile, and that's what's in this diagram here: honesty, humility, emotionality, X for extroversion, A for agreeableness, C for conscientiousness, O for openness. So we measured their personality, and we also measured their values using the Schwartz Portrait Values Questionnaire, SPVQ. And the Schwartz Portrait Values Questionnaire is the work of Shalom Schwartz, one of the most respected researchers in the world into values. And Shalom developed an instrument on which there has been literally millions of people measured across the world. And Schwartz is also one of the most cited academics in the world of values assessment. And so what we wanted to do is that through a mathematical model, we had the personality profiles and the values profiles of these 800 people, and we also had their engagement scores. And the reason we had this is because we ran engagement measures through some hundreds of people that we have had previously psych tested. And this is great because it means that people have completed their psych tests while they're applying for jobs, and that means you can apply these findings back to job applicant settings. By the way, thank you. I'm sure that some of you who are watching this video have completed our research questionnaires. Thank you for doing that. Please do it more. And there are a couple more that are just about to come out. So we look forward to working with you and with Deakin Uni to find some new wonderful things in the world of science. So the best predictors of engagement in terms of personality and values. The first is diligence. So if you want to hire people who are likely to be engaged, hire people who are diligent, and that's a personality characteristic, part of conscientiousness, and it means hardworking and committed to getting things done. Liveliness. Now, this is an extroversion characteristic. By the way, I'm an introvert, so I don't particularly like to give herograms for extroversion. But one of the things that I will say is that cheerful and optimistic people, which is liveliness, that is a good predictor of engagement. So people who are gloomy, pessimistic, negative, cynical don't tend to be anywhere near engaged as people who are cheerful. Greed avoidance. That's an honesty, humility characteristic of the Hexaco. And greed avoidance, what this beta weight is saying, is that if you are not greedy, you are much more likely to be engaged. And I find that rather poignant because it suggests to me that engagement is really partially generosity. In other words, it's about not being selfish. You'll also see that the value of conformity is a good predictor of engagement. And conformity is about respecting rules. And conformity is not about being sheepishly obedient. It's about respecting the rules of the social groups that are around you. People who are high in conformity are better at team playing because they respect the rules of the team that they belong to. People who are low in conformity are kind of maverick types and can be seen as difficult. Now, here's another extroversion characteristic, social boldness. And so, yes, I must grudgingly confess that those who are socially bold tend to be a little bit more engaged than those who are shy, but never mind. Altruism is about being soft-hearted, and that's a good predictor of engagement. Now, what this is showing you, this adjusted R square here, and you see the correlation is about 0.6 or so, but this adjusted R square is the degree to which people, the percentage, in effect, that can be explained in engagement by people's personality and values. Now, does 30% matter? Anybody who's ever tried to increase the levels of engagement in an engagement survey by 30% knows that it matters a lot. The second thing I'd say is that 30% in predicting something at work is actually extremely accurate. Reference checks tend to predict work performance with about 7% accuracy. The best interviews ever constructed seem to predict work performance with about 25% accuracy. So 30% is not to be sneezed at. And that is something that is worth considering. This is a personality profile. And just very briefly, this is the Hexaco as developed through the SACS Psychological Assessment Portal. And what you see here is that this person is low in emotionality, so they're quite emotionally stable. That's good. For most purposes, that means that they're less stress sensitive and frankly, usually a little bit easier to get along with at work than people who are high in emotionality tend to react strongly to things. This person is neither an extrovert nor an introvert, but they are quite lively, so they're likely to be engaged. They're quite agreeable, which is good because it means that they're not a very angry person. They're not a very angry person, and they should get along with people quite well. They're highly conscientious. So it's a fair presumption that this person might contribute to your levels of engagement at work rather than be a drain on them. SACS also has a measure of engagement to assess people as you hire them. So you can get an engagement score off the SACS portal. Now, once you've hired somebody, the next big determinant of people's levels of engagement is leader behaviours. And this is a study. We had something like 2,700 people from all different industry sectors, and we measured their levels of engagement, again, with the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale. And working with a master's student by the name of Emil Breidel, and this was in partnership with Simon Albrecht from Deakin University, we measured a bunch of leader behaviours which literature reviews suggested could cause engagement. And I wrote a bunch of questions about each of these leader behaviours, and we took them to 2,700 people, and then we analysed the results. And what we found is that there were 10 of these leader behaviours that performed from a mathematical point of view. And these 10 creates a learning environment, being supportive, fostering teamwork, which is really encouraging people to work together rather than individualistically. Encouraging autonomous decision-making is empowering people. Effective management of behaviours is where you do something when people are behaving badly. But as well as that, we have a separate one for creating clarity about appropriate behaviours. They are separate. They're correlated, but people can be good at creating clarity, but then not do anything about it, or vice versa. You also have effective management of underperformance and creating clarity about performance standards. So a similar kind of characteristic there. The two things are separate, although correlated. And then you have celebrating success, and you have optimism and positivity. So optimism and positivity is where a leader is acting in an optimistic and positive fashion. Now, the box here tells you which of these 10 things proved to be the best predictors of engagement in these 2,700 people. And the answer is the top 4 were encouraging autonomous decision-making. Now, what that means in a practical sense is that the most powerful thing that any leader can do to increase levels of engagement and therefore well-being among staff is to empower them. Now, we're going to show you something later on about research into stress that echoes this, but being a top-down leader is not optimum for people's well-being. Now, that doesn't mean you have to and should empower people totally all the time, but if you don't empower them enough, they are going to have lower levels of well-being. So encourages autonomous decision-making. Then you have optimism and positivity. And optimism and positivity is an extremely important determinant of engagement of employees. Now, what that means is that if you are a pessimistic and gloomy person, you need to get over that before you become a leader, because pessimism, gloom, cynicism actually brings down the well-being, the engagement of employees. And a researcher from the United States of America, a guy by the name of Kim Cameron, undertook studies where he measured positive behaviours of leaders and subsequently measured the well-being of staff. And not surprisingly, he found a strong correlation there. But he also found a correlation between the positive behaviours of leaders and the well-being of families of staff. Now, isn't that spooky? What that means is that the staff go home, their behaviours are affected by the behaviour of the leader, and when the leader's behaviours are positive, they cascade good behaviours into their family, and the well-being of the family is better. When the leader is negative, cynical, pessimistic, then that's bad not only for the employee but for the families of not only for the employee but for the families of the employee as well. Supportive leadership. Now, those of you who are statistically minded, you'll notice that this has a negative beta weight. Don't worry about that. There is a strong positive correlation between supportive leadership and engagement. This, for anybody who's interested in statistical, in multivariate stats, this is a thing called the suppressor variable. From a practical point of view, ignore the negative sign. Basically, supportive leadership does increase engagement, and also so does creating a learning environment. So 4 key behaviours. Now, let's make it really practical. What does all this mean? There are 3 styles of leadership. Of course, this is a simplification. These are not 3 styles of leadership. They're 3 points on a continuum from being a top-down boss type to being a facilitator. And I'll explain a little bit more what a facilitative leader is like. But okay, we've simplified this and said 3 characteristics or 3 types of leadership: top-down, consultation, facilitation. Top-down leadership is where a leader tells, so the leader's the blue dot, tells the staff member what to do. And of course, to be a good leader, you have to do that. If somebody turns up for their first day of work and says, well, what do I do? The best answer is not, well, what do you want to do? The best answer is, okay, well, here's your desk, sit down. We've got an appointment with you in our diary to induct you. Here's how you do your job, those kinds of things. So to be a good leader, you have to be top down. And also, even if the person is a mature employee and let's say their behaviors don't quite measure up, then you have to be top down. You have to say, okay, well, that's not acceptable. We don't do things like that here. Then there's consultation, and consultation is where the leader goes and asks people and says, all right, well, what do you think about this, that, and the other thing? Go back to their office, they think about the answers, and they decide. That's consultation. Now, if 3 people think X and 3 people think Y, and the consultative leader makes the decision, well, half the staff are going to say, well, why did you pretend to consult me? And anybody who's done consultation in this form knows that that's what happens. The alternative is a thing called facilitation. Now, facilitation is where a leader gets the staff together and has them in one place. And the one place could be physical, or it could be a Zoom meeting or WebEx meeting or a Microsoft Teams meeting or a phone conference or whatever. But the leader facilitates a discussion and says to people, okay, let's vote on what you guys think is the best solution. And then the leader goes ahead with the solution that's created by staff. Now, do you do this all the time? Do you do this all the time? Or do you do this all the time? No, the best leadership is one where a leader knows when it's appropriate to do this, when it's appropriate to do this, and when it's appropriate to do this. Most leaders vacillate between these two. This skill here of being a facilitative leader, where you actually run a process to cause staff to make up their own mind, is an investment in time, but it's an investment well spent. Because when you do that, two things happen. One, the levels of engagement and well-being increase, but as well as that, so do the skill levels of staff. And what that means is that they become more able to solve their own problems. And when leaders do this more, instead of staff saying, look, rescue me, which is one of the things that you get out of top-down leadership, they come to the leader and they say, look, we thought that we should do X. And the leader might say, well, hey, that's a great idea. Or the leader might say, well, yeah, but I think you should also think of this. And so the problem is half solved if the staff have been skilled up to do this. But in any event, this contributes to well-being. Now think of the 4 components of effective leadership that we showed you before. Encourages autonomous decision-making. I think it ticks that box. Optimism and positivity. Well, clearly it's optimistic because it's saying, I know you guys have got the solution. Supportive. It's clearly supportive of people because it's empowering, it's giving them the opportunity to express their skills. And of course, it creates a learning environment. If you cause people to solve problems and to take ownership from solving those problems, that increases their skills levels, but it also increases their levels of well-being. Now, this is a very important diagram. My thanks to Peter Cotton and Peter Hart for their article in Positive Psychology in the Workplace in the APS Journal. A very important simplification of the nature of engagement, because what we know from this is that employees live in 4 worlds. I said earlier, job, team, leader, organization. But 80% of a person's well-being comes from the local environment. My job, my team, my leader. This arrow here talks about proximal, which is things that are close to me, and distal, which are things that are far away from me. So my organization is for most people a concept. My job, well, I'm doing that every day. I'm immersed in it. The team that I work with, well, I'm doing that. I'm immersed in that. And the leader that I report to, which is my team leader or coordinator or manager or whomever, that person is somebody who is my most powerful influence from a leadership point of view. Why does this matter? If you take nothing away from this presentation apart from this point, do not try to deal with well-being at a corporate level. Now, of course, you need a well-being plan, which is a corporate document. But if you're not reaching into somehow the local groups, then you are dealing with 20% of the issue. And many organizations try to deal with well-being through things like mission, vision, values. They send for the masseurs at the corporate level. That sort of stuff simply does not work because you are not betting on the horse race of life, as an ex-Prime Minister of Australia used to say. 80% is better than 20%. And so what this means is if you want to deal with well-being, you must reach into teams, and the best way of reaching into teams is through the local leader. Now, if you think of your average organization, they have people called general managers, executives, directors, they have people called managers, they have people called coordinators, they have people called team leaders. In many organizations, if you measure who reports to whom, something like 70% of the employees will report to a team leader or a coordinator or a manager, let's say. The names mean different things in different organizations. So if you are not reaching into these local teams and causing those local teams to have their own plans, their own approaches to wellbeing, and the best way of doing this, by the way, is to cause the group to simply take more ownership of their future by facilitative decision-making. And by the way, I don't mean kind of theoretical teamworky type stuff. Let's become a better team. Let's work on the things that we really care about. So I came to this organization, I'm part of a sales team, we want to sell more. All right, well, let's get together and decide how we're going to sell more. But this leader is going to empower me to be part of the process of doing this. I'm in a not-for-profit that provides services to people with disability. All right, well, you know, the leader's going to facilitate. How can we do that better? That stuff is team building that works. Going whitewater rafting, please do that if you want. But what that tends to make is better whitewater rafters, and the relationships when you're whitewater rafting, anybody who's done this may know, you come back and you seem to slip into the old relationships. Yes, you might have a better understanding of people or something like that. But if you want to improve workplaces, dealing with work stuff is far better than sending for the masseurs or going whitewater rafting. Now, how can you assess this? I mean, this is the SACS 360-degree feedback instrument, and you see that this particular leader, this is their encourages autonomous decision-making score. Let's call that empowerment. And so their self-rating, their leader rating, and their indirect report rating. So these are 4 cohorts of people who are assessed in this 360-degree feedback process. You notice identical results. They all think about population average, apart from the direct reports. So this is an important learning for this leader, because whatever he or she is doing with the direct reports maybe could be applied more broadly in terms of empowering people, because it's working really well with his or her own staff, but not so well with the leader or the direct report. Or certainly the leaders in the direct reports are not seeing it so much. Now, I've talked a lot about engagement and how it is related to well-being. So the question is, does it vary by industry? The answer is actually not that much, but it does vary to a certain extent, particularly if you look at the upper and lower extremes. So what are the most engaged workforces in Australia? Health, and that includes disability and aged care services, and primary industries, which is interesting. So the rugged individualist out on the land farming, looking after moo cows or wheat or sheep or something, they're highly engaged in their work. And local government, interestingly, because state government, you'll notice, is quite low in comparison, but local government, I suspect that what you've got here is you've got an immediacy of outcomes. What you've got is you've got people relating to their customers, relating to the things that determine success. You've got certain relationships happening. Interestingly, health services here in Australia has got a lot of bad press in recent times for behaviours of senior staff members. But in all the measures that we've undertaken in the sector, it's actually psychologically a pretty healthy sector. Sure, there are bad behaviours from individual, but it's not endemic. On the other hand, down here, you've got fast-moving consumer goods. And so that's sort of the stuff that you get in the convenience store near the counter. So sweets, junk food, those kind of things. For whatever reason, when we measured some thousands of people across Australia and New Zealand, we found that that was not a very highly engaged sector. What I would therefore argue is that psychologically, this is likely to have, as a sector, lower levels of well-being than, let's say, these sectors here. So it does vary by industry. Does engagement vary with age? Well, yes, it does, and quite markedly, as a matter of fact. Older people are much more engaged than younger people. When I first showed these results, somebody said to me, well, that's because young people have got better things to do with themselves. Well, possibly, but anyway, I suspect it's because when people are young, maybe they haven't quite found their niche in life yet. But when you're 51, you've probably tried a few things and you've found something that you like and can relate to, and maybe you've been around for a while and you've found colleagues that you like. But in any event, you know, those are really quite significant differences, 3.69 to 4.46 on what was, I think, a 7-point scale. So that's a very significant difference between levels of age. So older people do, fortunately, tend to be more engaged in their work than younger people. And the reason I say fortunately is that if you are young and you're sort of thinking, well, I don't like my work very much, there's hope for you. Does engagement vary with salary? Well, yes, it does, and in a very, very interesting way, which is to say that people who are paid $70,000 or less tend to be quite engaged in their work. People who are paid $200,000 or more tend to be quite engaged in their work. Look at these poor middle managers, 70 to 150,000 in particular. Look how gloomy they are. Now, this suggests that middle managers have lower levels of well-being than people who are lowly paid or people who are highly paid. What's going on here? Well, it's distinctly possible that these people are making the decisions and these people are receiving the decisions, and these poor bunnies in the middle are the ones who have to pass on the bad news. Now, I don't know, that's a theory, but one of the things that we found, and by the way, we found this effect in other elements of well-being. Middle management doesn't seem to be particularly blessed with well-being, but let me just say, what an enormous opportunity for the Australian workforce to increase the levels of well-being of these middle managers. And I suspect that the true way of doing that is for these people to empower these people more, to act in more facilitative style. And these people will then still be happy because these people will be involved in the decision. But imagine the extra productivity, given that there are strong links between productivity and engagement. Imagine the extra productivity that you could get from the middle management sector by doing this. How to improve for it? Well, recruit for it, clearly. Assess whether people are likely to be engaged. Lead for it. Optimistic, positive leadership, supportive, kind, helpful leadership, facilitative, empowering leadership. And of course, creating clarity for people. We'll talk about this a little bit more in stress because I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But stress is heavily determined by ambiguity. Human beings do not like stress. So having a job description is not enough. What you really need is a description and a clarity about the outcomes that jobs need. That's the quickest way to create clarity and, of course, acceptable behaviours. Now, I want to talk about resilience because resilience can be argued to be engagement at an individual level. Resilience is a protective factor, a capacity for successful developmental outcomes. What do we mean by successful developmental outcomes? In other words, growing from stress, growing from tough times, managing high pressure. And here you have the Clonin definition, which is probably the most commonly accepted definition in psychology for resilience. General capacity, which means that it doesn't just apply to one thing. Flexible, resourceful adaptation to external and internal stressors. External being things like bad economic times, COVID-19. Internal stressors being things like tiredness, emotions, those kinds of things. So we can cope with whatever life throws us. And one of the things that we know is that when people are truly resilient, they actually get better from tough times. They actually grow. I would welcome you to undertake a brief thought experiment. Think of the most developmental experience that you've had in your life. Think of the thing that really caused you to grow. I would suspect that maybe it was a challenging, perhaps even a tough experience. People, when you ask them what caused them to grow more than anything, very often they will say it was the traumatic, the difficult thing. So what has resilience got to do with engagement? Well, there's a strong link between the two. So if you recruit resilient people, you are much more likely to have an engaged workforce. And if you increase the levels of engagement through effective leadership, such as facilitative leadership, then you will have more individual resilience. So it could be said that resilience is in fact engagement at an individual, and it could be said that engagement is resilience at a group level. Point out correlations in this study between Simons and Buitenbach. I mean, that's a strong correlation to show that there is a strong link between the two. Now, can you measure this on the way in? Of course you can. We have a resilience test which many people use. As you can see, this individual has a high level of resilience, and so their resilience risk is low, 62. This is not a percentile, by the way. It's a thing called a standard score, a T-score, and 50 is population average. Don't worry too much about the numbers. The word high tells you what you need to know in that circumstance. Does resilience vary by industry? Well, yes, it does. And one of the things that we find, interestingly, the least resilient sector in these big samples that we've collected is the construction sector, which is kind of a tough industry. I'm not quite sure how that comes about. And frankly, we don't have that many clients in the construction sector, which has allowed me to find out what's going on there. But it seems to attract people who are relatively lower in resilience. I would say that people in the construction sector tend to get emotional a lot. That's based on the experience of dealing with about 10 construction companies. I don't know, maybe this is one of the reasons why it's attracting, for some reason, people who are low in resilience. But property and business services, cultural and recreational services, finance and insurance, these are kind of people orientated, aren't they? And so it seems that they're attracting resilient people. I don't think, by the way, that resilience is massively changed by the industry sector. It would be to a certain extent, But I think what you've got here is a sort of a selection effect. The resilient people tend to go into these sectors. And certainly the property and business services sector has a number of interpersonal challenges. So maybe resilient people just can't stay there. Sorry, people who are low in resilience just can't stick it out. But for whatever reasons, there are differences in sectors. But also resilience can be shown to vary by income. If you're earning less than $150,000, chances are in large samples, the levels of resilience are pretty much the same, whether you're earning almost nothing or $150,000. But once you go from 150 to 200 plus, it jumps up a lot. I wonder if that's what people are buying in senior executives. They're buying higher levels of resilience. They're also buying higher levels of IQ. We know that because if you measure IQ by income level, it does correlate very rapidly or very effectively with people's income. So one of the things that you are buying when you pay people more is IQ points. We hope you're buying that. If you're IQ testing on the way in, you will be buying that. But certainly we see that it seems that one of the things that you have in senior executive ranks or senior management ranks in organizations is higher levels of well-being, of resilience, and that's important. So improving resilience, well, you can test for it on the way in, so that's a recruitment issue. But second, one of the things that you can do, and I don't have time to go through all of these in detail, but there are a range of positive psychology activities which can increase people's levels of resilience. And at the end of this presentation, there is a set of references which deal with some of this matter. I would encourage people to go to websites such as Martin Seligman's Authentic Happiness website, where he has a fair bit about resilience. There's a pretty good set of resources on YouTube about resilience. So you can access some of this information. But techniques like reducing focus on the past and concentrating on the future, that increases resilience. Gratitude exercises such as 3 blessings. That's where every day you write down the 3 good things that happened to you. That increases resilience. It also decreases anxiety and depression. Learned optimism exercises such as 3 anticipations. Every so often, let's say once every week or something, sit down and think about, well, what do I have to look forward to? Being optimistic can be developed, and it certainly has a big impact on resilience. Acts of generosity. Did you know that being generous to people makes us more resilient? Signature strength exercises are things like working out what we're good at. And Seligman's website, as I mentioned before, Authentic Happiness, has signature strength questionnaires which you can complete to identify your signature strengths. I also think that in terms of group activities, these things, through blessings, it's a worthwhile thing in your team meetings to say, okay, well, what happened this week that I'm happy with? You can also say, what are we looking forward to this week? Acts of generosity can be done at a team level. What can we do to make somebody else's work life easier? Signature strength exercises. Well, let's sit down as a group and work out what we're really good at. Mindfulness, such as meditation. I'm not going to go into that in great detail again. YouTube has fantastic resources, but there are also a bunch of apps such as Calm, Headspace, which can be used to build mindfulness. It works, by the way, for most people. Forming collaborative work groups to work together to create an ideal future. So that's something that's sponsored by facilitative leadership. So facilitative leadership can massively assist resilience by virtue of its empowerment characteristic, but also teaching people to be more self-reliant. Measurement of leader behaviours from time to time can also help here, because these initiatives, all, I'm sure you've understood by the way I've described them, require local leadership to be able to do these things. Stress. We're going to deal briefly with stress. There are 2 types of stressors at work. Now, the first I'm going to call good stressors, challenge demands. The reason I call them good stressors is that as the levels of challenge demands increase, the levels of engagement also increase. And so they, believe it or not, higher workload often correlates with higher levels of well-being and engagement at work. And it depends on a couple of things. I mean, obviously you've got to have the resources to do it. And yes, there is a thing called burnout, but in most cases, increasing workload does not of itself cause people to have lower levels of well-being. processing information. So people actually like to process information because it makes their work interesting, and so does problem solving. They're positive stressors which tend to correlate with increased well-being. But then there are negative stressors. They're called hindrance demands, things that get in the way of doing it and you're enjoying your job. So role ambiguity, where I'm not sure what my job is supposed to achieve, not a list of tasks on a job description. What's my job really supposed to achieve? Am I supposed to make customers happy? Am I supposed to save money? What am I supposed to do? That kind of knowledge helps reduce stress. Role conflict is where people are asking you to do things that are conflicting. Different people want you to do different things. That's not good for stress. And social exclusion, where being treated by outsider as colleagues, I mean, that's terrible for your levels of well-being and engagement. They are real hindrances. So this is an example of our measure of stress at work. And what you see here is that workload in this particular case, so we've got good stress challenges, workload is high. The bad news is that information processing and problem solving is low. So what that means is that these people are doing a lot of quite boring work, repetitive, drudgery, I suppose would be one way to put it. But also the bad stress in general is quite high. So role ambiguity is high. I mean, clearly I don't really know what I'm supposed to be achieving here. Conflicting expectations. People are asking me to pulling me in different directions as the common expression. And social exclusion, it's population average, but I guess you'd probably ideally want that lower depending on what it is that your aspirations are for an organization. So it paints a picture of a stressful work environment, lots of work and boring. And not surprisingly, when we measured this particular workplace, we found low levels of engagement and therefore low levels of well-being. Now, the relationship between demands, stressors, and control. So if you have low demands and low control, that's a sleepy environment. You don't have much control, but you also don't have much stress. If you have high demands and low control, you tend to have high levels of potential burnout. Burnout is not an imaginary thing. It's a real psychological phenomenon. It's bad. People can be very damaged by burnout, and it is, of course, an indicator of low well-being. So once more, we're back to empowerment, aren't we? Empowerment is about giving people control. And so we're talking here about facilitative leadership. Comfortable is where demands are low, but control is high. I mean, that's sort of a relaxed environment. And then you have a situation where you have high demands and high control. That's a peak experience, but maybe time limited. In other words, people cannot sustain that forever. And so what we find in the stress literature is that levels of support and levels of control are how you manage stress. Let's provide people with support, be kind and friendly and helpful to them, but as well as that, let's empower them as much as we can. And so we increase levels of engagement by facilitative leadership, but we also manage stress by doing that. Are men or women more stressed? Here's another snapshot from the world of our research. The answer is they're exactly the same. In terms of both good and bad stressors, almost exactly the same. Interesting, really, when you think of it. These are incredibly similar figures, 5.20, 5.18, 2.89 and 2.84. Well, not surprisingly, they weren't statistically significantly different, but that's amazingly similar. Are different industries more negatively stressful? Well, personal and other services. You remember that we said that people in the people game were more resilient. Well, it's a good thing because these are more stressful, and hence my theory that maybe people who aren't resilient simply have to get out of these sectors because they can't hack it. Agriculture, forestry, and fishery tend to have less stressors than hindrance demands than some of the people orientated. Interesting, isn't it? If you look at these low stress industries are the ones that tend to deal with things, but the high stress industries are the ones that tend to deal with people. There's the intrinsic challenge of customer service. How to manage? Well, stress sensitivity, look, if you recruit people who are emotionally stable, that's probably enough. This is less of an issue of recruitment. To predict how stressed people are likely to be, we've tried to do it with IQ and personality. I have diagrams. I haven't wasted your time with that in this presentation. It's more a leadership issue. So leading as a facilitator once more is the answer. Leading with support, leading with optimism, and also increasing role clarity also helps. Now I'm going to finish up by talking about a thing called diversity climate. And the idea is that you cannot have high levels of well-being in a contemporary workforce without appropriate levels of diversity climate inclusion. So this is a perception that the organisation cares about diversity and sponsors it, a belief that leaders model inclusion. So a number of studies, so Reinwald and Butler, found that if you don't have appropriate welcoming and inclusive behaviours in a workforce, so welcoming of things like ethnic diversity, welcoming of things like gender diversity, welcoming of things like lifestyle diversity, people tend to leave those organisations more. Performance tends to be higher in organisations which are inclusive. And what we've found is that there's a recruitment component to this. This is a big study that we undertook with Jeremy Anglim and colleagues from Deakin University and some other academics as well. But we measured negative attitudes towards ethnicity, disability, and the elderly. And what we found is that if people are sexist, which is what gender means, so high scores on gender means sexism, high scores on ethnicity means racism. Look at this, a correlation of 0.7. So sexists tend to be racist, but they also tend to be unkind towards people with disability or the elderly. So isn't that interesting? There's a set of correlations here that show that, well, prejudiced people tend to be prejudiced and they tend to be universally prejudiced. All of these correlations, by the way, were statistically significant. So chances are, if you recruit, what you should do is you should measure a thing called attitudes towards diversity. And many of our clients do measure attitudes towards diversity. And we measure these 4 things that were on the last page: gender, ethnicity, age, and disability. And so a person who scores high in gender is sexist, ethnicity racist, age ageist, and disability means that people are uncomfortable with people with disability. Now this is a good score because this person's low on all of them, and it means that you can be comfortable that this person is not going to be likely to have negative attitudes in this respect. Now, what kinds of things cause people to have negative attitudes to women? I won't go through this in great detail, just go to this box here. But people who are low in social self-esteem, isn't it sad? Self-doubters tend to be sexist. People who are disorganized tend to be sexist. People who are frankly not that smart, so low verbal reasoning, tend to be sexist. People with values low in universalism. Universalism is all about wanting to make the world a better place. Those people tend to be more sexist. And also people who are low in self-direction, which means basically I really don't want to determine my own fate. I'm happy to be told what to do. They tend to be more sexist. Are older or younger people more tolerant? Well, it's younger people tend to experience these days more ethnic diversity, at least in Australia. Australia has become significantly more ethnically diverse over the decades. So older people tend to be less tolerant, largely because there is very strong research evidence that exposure to diversity makes people more tolerant to diversity. Are men or women more tolerant? Well, I'm a man, and I must confess that this result doesn't particularly surprise me. Women are vastly more tolerant of ethnicity, gender, disability, and the elderly than men are. So men are consistently more prejudiced. High is bad in these profiles. So something that we might have suspected, but here is very strong research evidence. And diversity climate by sector, I guess one of the things that's interesting, mining tends to be extremely tolerant of ethnic diversity. So does education, health and community services. And I reckon the unifying feature between these, it was interesting when we saw this result, I made contact with some people in mining and they said, well, look, mining is ethnically diverse because you get people coming from all over the world to get involved in mining. So companies can tend to have ethnic diversity. Manufacturing and wholesale trade, interestingly, tend to be low in diversity climate, as is agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. So how to change it? Well, firstly, you can measure it. This is a measure of diversity climate for a particular organisation. And you can recruit for it and lead for it. Recruit smart people, recruit hardworking, optimistic, cheerful, and generous people. You test for it on the way in, and once more, lead for it. Model inclusion in leadership behaviour, educate people about inclusion, and make sure that your policies and procedures favour inclusion. So, summary and conclusion. Well, it's measurable. Wellbeing is measurable. It's also evidence-based. You can make a business case for wellbeing. It's multifaceted, but the facets have many common features. And one of the real common features is the fact that facilitative, empowering leadership is powerful, and also positive emotions are absolutely crucial. Positive emotions in terms of happiness, positive emotions in terms of energy and commitment, flow. So you can recruit for a workforce high in wellbeing, you can lead for a workforce high in wellbeing, and leadership for that kind of workforce is a mix of empowerment and accountability. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about a truly engaged and high wellbeing workforce is a workforce where everybody seeks to act as a leader and they're empowered to do so. Imagine that, a workplace where people are empowered to act as leaders. Even though they might be relatively junior, they're empowered to act as leaders in the matters that relate to them. And they want to do it. They know that they can do it. That's the optimum organisation. Of course, within a framework of clear organisational behaviours, because people now need to know what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And here's a reference list, some of the references, the vast majority of the references that we've mentioned in this paper, in this presentation rather. So if you want to get a hold of this presentation, please don't hesitate to drop us a note. Thanks very much for listening, and may the rest of your day be high in wellbeing.